Okay, so what we are looking at today are some of the basics of our Constitution. The first thing we need to understand when talking about the Constitution is, yeah, it's in response to the Articles of Confederation, but the intention wasn't to totally, throw away the Articles of Confederation. It was intended to be an amendment to the Articles of Confederation. But as we saw in that simulation yesterday, it became really clear that there was just no way to continue to build off of this document. And instead, they did decide to start from scratch. And throughout the entire convention, you're coming into it with these delegates and these framers that, we're coming from vastly different areas with different, levels of financial stability. You had some of the states like New Hampshire that had done, pretty well after the war. You had states that were in debt like South Carolina. But important to keep in mind that everyone at this process was generally wealthy, was prominent, and was a white male. It will become recurring throughout. And so they decide to start from scratch. And even though they are coming from lots of different places, there is continual negotiation as well as compromise. Compromise is going to be the name of the game here in this constitutional convention. And we see it in a lot of different ways, but we'll start here with this great compromise. And the great compromise is how we form our Congress today. Okay? So, two plans are posed at the Constitutional Convention. The first being the Virginia Plan, the second being the New Jersey Plan. Let me write this in a different color marker so you guys can easily see. So here in the Virginia Plan, it is bicameral, meaning two branches, two houses, but it definitely favors the larger states. They say in this Virginia Plan that, the states with the most people should have the most say. That makes the most sense. If you're considering who's contributing the most to the economy, whose interests you have to keep in mind the most, it would be under this Virginia Plan. So obviously it will favor large states, meaning based on population, and it also calls for a real strong national government, or a real strong central government. This plan would give these larger states a tremendous amount of power, something that we'll continue to see in these compromises. But take that with the New Jersey Plan. It's posed as unicameral, meaning we don't need two different branches of this, what will become Congress. We just need one thing that is based on equal representation. And of course, that will benefit these small states. Each one obviously has their argument. The New Jersey Plan says if we are to, all come together and form this union, we deserve an equal say. Whereas the Virginia Plan says, let's keep, the interests of as many people in mind as possible. And eventually, this great compromise will occur with the Connecticut Plan. It will be bicameral with a House and a Senate. Of course, we know today the House is based on population. The larger your state, the more people you have, the more representatives you have in the House, and the Senate is equal. Every single state has the same number of senators. House of Representatives, your number depends on your population, okay? The people that come to this conclusion, that write this Connecticut plan, is known as what's called the Grand Committee, a small subset of those that went to the Constitutional Convention. They will eventually negotiate the Great Compromise. And they had to convince the large states. You know, they know that the places that had really grown, they do hold the cards. They have the most power. And so they have to figure out a way, well, how are we going to agree, or how are we going to get the large states to agree to something like this? And what they say is that the House will be responsible for starting all of the tax revenue bills. Okay, so the House starts tax revenue bills. What does this mean? Well, the House, which again favors states with larger populations, will be able to create any law, legislation, whatever, that determines the level of taxes that are received. That benefits larger states because they have more people, a greater number of people paying taxes. Once those, are started, then they go through to the Senate. Okay, so this is just one way of, making it more amenable for these large states. This gives the House and the larger states an advantage. The next compromise that we come to is what's known as the Electoral College. And obviously there's a lot of conflict about the Electoral College today, but it was a compromise at its heart. The Electoral College essentially sought, there's people that want to elect the president, people want to choose the president. And there's people that want Congress to choose the president. And so the compromise is made to form this Electoral College, okay? This would be a participatory democracy, people having their voices directly heard. This would be much more of an elite democracy. And what we see is this somewhat blending of ideas. So in modern day, depending on how we vote in elections, the Electoral College is set up and electorates are sent to cast their votes for whichever candidate the people wanted, right? But this doesn't always, strictly mean a participatory democracy. In fact, it results in gerrymandering. It results in what we call swing states that have more influence than other states. And so a lot of people are calling for the abolishment of this Electoral College. This next compromise is one that should seem pretty familiar, and that was the 3/5 compromise. And that is, essentially the idea that Southern states for the longest time didn't want slaves to have any sort of rights, okay? But all of a sudden, when it becomes beneficial, they think, oh, we want our slaves to be counted as, full participatory citizens, because that would raise the population of southern states, increasing their influence in the House, allowing them to pass more of these tax revenue bills. So they don't want slaves to have rights, but all of a sudden they say, okay, everyone counts as a citizen of Virginia or South Carolina or whatever. That raises our population. It's actually the North that proposes this 3/5 compromise, that for every 5 slaves, it is 3 full citizens, essentially, as well as free persons can obviously count as citizens. So this really, really, really benefits the South. In fact, it gives the South a huge advantage in elections. Most presidents before the Civil War are from the South. Up until the 1850s, 1860s, a tremendous number of presidents are from Virginia. It's where most of it's the state that has the most presidents. Just in the first 4 presidents, you have 3 that are from Virginia. And a large reason for that is because of this 3/5 compromise. In addition to that, you kind of have this addendum, this compromise on the importation of slaves. And what that is basically the North saying, we want to stop this slave trade. Okay. This has gone on for far too long. We have these Enlightenment ideals that have come over, and the South comes to a compromise. And they say, well, Congress can't ban it. Congress won't ban the slave trade for 20 years. After the ratification of this Constitution, Congress has to wait 20 years before they ban this slave trade. And then once they do, the North has to send all of the fugitive slaves back. Any slave that had run away to the North and had been there for 20 years had to be sent back to the South, and then the slave trade would be banned. No more slaves would be brought back into the United States. The South would agree to that. So that is that compromise. We'll see what happens and how that, in a pretty significant way, leads to the Civil War and the 13th Amendment. Moving on, the final compromise is how we propose and ratify amendments. It's only happened 27 times. The framers, those at the Constitutional Convention, they really wanted updates to this Constitution because they knew that times were going to change, things were going to be different. And they tried their best to come up with a system that would make it easier for these amendments to happen. But really what we've seen is that it's extremely difficult. So there's 2 steps to it. There's the proposal of an amendment, and then there's the ratification or the passing of the amendment. The most simple way to consider how this happens is basically 2/3 of both houses have to agree to propose this amendment. 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate say, okay, this thing needs to happen. We can also talk about how 2/3 of all state legislatures can do this, but it's never happened in history. The tricky part is ratifying the amendment, and that happens with 3/4 of state legislatures. So 2/3 of the House of Representatives say we can do this. 2/3 of the Senate say we can do this. It then goes to all 50 state legislatures. If 3/4 of them agree to ratify this amendment, it officially becomes an amendment. The only time that this hasn't been the case, this has happened, this connection right here has happened 26 times. The only other way that it didn't happen was with the amendment to the previous amendment. So when they got rid of prohibition with the 21st Amendment, I believe, instead of it being state legislatures, they all had state conventions. They all brought everyone together. It wasn't, a full popular vote, but again, semantics. We don't need to get into the details of it. This is by far the majority of the way that this happens, okay? So these are the basic compromises that we see, but it has still led to significant debates today. It's led to debates over what is the role of the federal and state government. That term federalism keeps coming up, and it'll come up later next week. But people are always questioning, when is the time for the federal government to overstep the state government? We see that, following 9/11. We see it with things like the Patriot Act. Or we can go back even further to a court case that we'll learn about called Engel v. Vitale. That's a famous court case about school prayer. All of these things are continually debated in American politics, and they all stem from federalism. And we'll continue to learn about that, like I said, next week. And it all kind of stems from, these compromises. So if we're looking at the details of the Constitution a little bit, we have to talk about the separation of powers and these checks of balances. So, of course, we know each branch does different things. And it all is connected to legislation. The creation, implementation, and interpretation of law. These are the three things that our government is assigned to do. And what we'll see here is that there is a system of checks and balances to make sure that no person, no branch has much power. With this system of checks and balances, the executive, the legislative, the judicial, the intention is that no one branch can overpower the other branches. They also want to make it accessible for everyday people to be involved. The intention was that citizens can interact and influence policy. So what we see here is kind of a very basic chart. So, what we'll see is here's how the judicial branch checks the executive and legislative. Here's how legislative checks these two. Here's how executive checks these two. We're going to start down here with judicial because it is very simple. They declare things unconstitutional, okay? They can declare presidential acts, or they can declare legislation unconstitutional. That is their real check on these other two branches. And it's what makes having a, Supreme Court justice appointment so influential is you have this limited group of people that generally, interpret laws with some sort of sway or bias, or at least that's what you think. And so to have a Supreme Court justice that follows your intended track of policy, that means that your legislation is going to be upheld long after you leave the presidency or long after you leave your respective, branch of legislation, whether it's a House or the Senate. We're going to move up here to the executive. And so again, very simple. The executive branch can veto legislation and they can appoint judges. Well, appoint/nominate. We'll get into that in a second. That is their real responsibility. And so what the legislative branch does is they approve these nominations, but if someone is, has clearly done something unconstitutional or illegal, they can vote to impeach and later remove judges. The relationship between the legislative branch and the executive branch is a little bit more detailed, and I'm going to try and narrow it down a little bit. So basically, they approve those nominations, right? The executive branch makes nominations. Each of the legislative branches play a role in approving those nominations. Let's say that the executive branch has vetoed legislation. The legislative branches can overturn vetoes as long as they have 2/3 in both houses. Okay, so legislation has passed through both houses of Congress. The executive branch has vetoed that legislation. It returns back. As long as 2/3 approve on both houses, it becomes legislation. And of course, they can impeach and later remove the president. There's more details about funding that we'll get into, especially the politics of federal funds, but that is a later lesson. So that will be it for the basics of the Constitution. I hope this was helpful, and I will be in the meeting if you have questions.